Hi, I'm Wyatt Cash at Scoop News Group, and we're here with at CyberTalks with Chris Ritter, Principal Systems Engineer and Application Architect at Dell Technologies. Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let me start by asking, what does it mean to have a baseline level of cybersecurity in this new age we're in 2021?
Well, I guess whether it being 2021 or 1995, I think, from a baseline perspective, it's about, having that minimum number of technologies or the minimum number of things that you need to protect and safeguard your information. I think it's pretty straightforward in the sense that most organizations have at some level gone through the process and defined what's important to protect, right? Which systems, which financial components, which physical resources and so forth that they need to put some type of wrapper around. But today, I think, right, when we look at 2021, the difference really just from a handful of years ago is more about the permutations of requirements to balance different user needs. And one of the big ones I think that we're seeing right now is about mobility. And mobility, not just from a data access perspective, where the user is in multiple places during the day or during their work process. It could be about the data itself, right? Because data can be mobile between applications. It could be mobile between organizations within a company that consumes that data or uses that data, or even in the sense from a consumer standpoint, a lot of cases, or health records, that data is actually mobile between organizations or even companies, or a company and a government entity, right? And so putting a wrapper around that is much more daunting task to be comprehensive and also cost effective. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that you see now than what we used to design for in the recent past.
Absolutely. Next, how did the pandemic affect the way that organizations that you work with continue to move forward in securing their data?
In terms of ranking all the possible factors that had an impact to an organization, I think it's pretty hard to say. But there are definitely a few obvious pandemic-induced organizational changes that may have had a huge negative impact. Some of them may even be realized, depending upon who you talk to or which organizations you talk to. Some may not have manifested yet. I would think that working from home was definitely an extremely difficult challenge for organizations to apply corporate security to just public Wi-Fi and home networks. If you think about just the massive shift from a physical location where working from home became the overwhelming percentage of individuals and where they were located, it effectively created a solar system full of satellite offices, if you'll pardon the pun. But at the end of the day, it's almost an infinite number of connection points to manage, and that alone can be extremely challenging when you think about just day-to-day updates and the small ecosystem and the bubble around that individual person. Organizations faced, I think, real cultural challenges, due to that workforce becoming remote. While if you think about the behavior of an individual, where they are very likely to be diligent in their effort to secure access points or data and even displays while they're in an office setting or when they're traveling in their job, from a field dispatch scenario, for example, I think the distance and isolation that a lot of people felt now that we were in the pandemic and were locked into that work from home or that work from remote environment is that it gives them a false sense of security because there is nobody around, right? And so it's hard to determine the impact of being isolated, I think, because we're just beginning to come out of the pandemic, but does the isolation contribute to lack security? Probably so. And I think time will tell. In the near future, we'll start to see as people come back to an office or come back to a more formal setting, or as organizations start to assess, where they are after the pandemic. I think that you'll see potential security situations appear. Right? It's very likely, to me at least, that the pandemic is the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, right? Because I think it provided a very real example of how quickly things can change, right? So most organizations were not ready for this massive shift just from a work from home perspective. Take everything else out of the picture. The shift from the physical location and how to support the remote worker, lots of things broke. And I think because of this, you're starting to see that this is a really good example that existing cybersecurity policies are giving way to new techniques, right? Zero trust policies would be the likely policy or the type of architecture that people are really starting to gravitate to, because it gives us that framework that you can support different requirements that organizations need to support, right? The ebb and the flow of access of different groups or different people without really compromising the posture that you've created.
Well, next, Chris, what kinds of changes do you expect to see in the cyber world over the coming year or two?
Over the next year or so, I do expect the organizations to quickly gravitate, depending upon their level of maturity, to either creating or implementing what they just created or enforcing what they've just implemented. If you think about it from a new architecture, a zero trust policy, they need to start thinking about what that next architecture is going to look like. But at the end of the day, the zero trust architectures are really going to be the most comprehensive way to facilitate the varying needs of the user communities without really requiring a different set of rules or a different set of technologies and monitoring mechanisms for each user community, right? As it sounds, right, a zero trust model is really just verifying anything and everything that's attempting to access or execute. It needs to be trusted, right? And these policies don't just apply to people, they apply to applications, for example. So if you think about how to deploy that from the foundation up, we look at it, Dell Technologies, we look at it from the foundation as you go up towards the application, right? So secure boot processes that have been defined and validated by the NSA, right? Dell is the only provider that has a secure boot process. And then applying that technology with unique operating systems, for example, is one of many ways to create a secure foundation without having to stack on a large group of technologies or vendors to make that foundation complete.
Well, lastly, Chris, what is the biggest thing that you run into and that you think most people still don't appreciate or understand about cybersecurity?
I think that most, at some level, understand cybersecurity and the need for it and at a high level, what it is. But I think it's more about appreciating, right? I think right now, I still don't think that people have a sense of urgency or that rigorous discipline around cybersecurity. The old saying that we have to be right 100% of the time, but the bad actor only has to be right once, I think it still applies, right? I get a sense that there's still a significant percentage of organizations who don't stringently commit to the full execution of their security tools, or they wait to the next budget cycle or cost-cutting measure to implement new policies or security technologies. And I feel like, to me, at least, it appears that there's still a large percentage of organizations who are looking to evaluate technologies or strategies like a defense in depth strategy, right, to accommodate every possible user need. And at the end of the day, they become paralyzed into inaction, right? And while a defense in depth strategy is very good, right, because there's so many different layers that are designed to become wrappers around the physical asset or the piece of information that you're trying to secure, but it has so many moving parts. And so because of that, it has its inherent vulnerabilities, right? Just strictly from patching cycles and updating in that orchestrated dance that you have to have amongst vendors and technologies to make sure all these pieces are working together. And I think with that said, and you look back just the last 6 to 12 months, you've seen supply chain attacks, you've seen ransomware attacks, you've seen stolen IP and hacks into sensitive agencies. And I think at this point that there's enough evidence to prove that nobody needs to be convinced that there's a constant threat out there, right? It's now more than ever, it's quite evident that the advanced persistent threats and your organized cyber criminals or even the individual hacker is capable of crippling or destroying an organization. And that a threat that can affect the individual consumer, us sitting here talking to each other, the mom and pop shop that's down the street or the largest organization in the world, I think everybody is a potential candidate or a threat surface, if you want to talk about it that way. And the attacks are becoming more sophisticated and financially devastating. So to me at this point, I don't think that there's really a choice to be made. It's more about understanding where we're at, and it's imperative to deploy technology and fix the leaks and the holes in the security stance and to be vigilant, right? And with that said, I think that zero trust and risk management strategies really should be the primary position for organizational decision makers and have that support from executive leadership in every organization.
Well, Chris Ritter, thank you so much for taking time to share some of your insights with our CyberTalks watch viewers, and I just appreciate your time today and sharing some of that with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.